The spring of 1945 marked the final brutal chapters of a war that had torn the world apart. In Europe, the Allies were closing in on Berlin, but in the Pacific, the fight was far from over. The ocean had become the ultimate battleground, a stage where new forms of warfare would decide the fate of nations. The once untouchable battleship, the king of the seas for centuries, had been dethroned. In its place stood a new monarch, the aircraft carrier. At Okinawa, the last great amphibious assault of World War II, a new kind of war was unfolding. Task Force 58, the United States Navy's most powerful fleet, and Task Force 57, the British Royal Navy's formidable carrier group, would face an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. The Kamikaze. These desperate, human-guided missiles would test the resilience of Allied naval power in ways that no one had expected. The British and American navies, although united in purpose, each relied on their own vastly different design philosophies for their aircraft carriers. And in this trial by fire, these philosophies would clash, deciding which would survive the deadly storm of suicide attacks. In the Pacific, the stakes had never been higher. The U.S. Navy's Essex-class carriers were built for overwhelming offense, designed to project power across vast distances. Meanwhile, the British built their Illustrious-class carriers for defense, designed to endure, to absorb punishment, and to keep fighting. It was this stark contrast in design philosophies that would be put to the ultimate test at Okinawa. Here, the Allies would find out just how far their carriers could go in the face of Japan's ultimate weapon, the Kamikaze. As the Allies began to circle Okinawa, the stage was set for a violent confrontation. The island, key to the final Allied push toward Japan, would become the proving ground for a new form of warfare. Vice Admiral Mark Pete Mitcher of the U.S. Navy's Task Force 58 commanded a fleet that would unleash a storm of aircraft on Japan, while the British Task Force 57, led by Vice Admiral Sir Bernard Rawlings, had its own strategy for neutralizing Japanese airfields. Their primary weapons were the fleet carriers, the heart of both navies, but each side had its own philosophy about what made a carrier effective in battle. The U.S. Navy's Essex-class carriers were built for power. They were designed to launch a massive number of aircraft with minimal downtime, using lightweight materials that allowed for a larger air group. The Essex was designed to project overwhelming force, sending wave after wave of bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes into enemy territory. The British, on the other hand, had a different vision. They had learned the hard lessons of survival from their campaigns in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, where the constant threat of German U-boats and Luftwaffe attacks forced them to prioritize durability. Their Illustrious-class carriers were built with a heavily armored flight deck and reinforced hull, designed to take hits and keep fighting, while the U.S. Navy focused on annihilation and overwhelming offensive power. The British strategy was built around endurance. The Essex-class carriers were meant to strike swiftly, devastating the enemy with precision and numbers. The British carriers, like the HMS Formidable, were designed to endure and keep functioning even when hit by bombers or torpedoes. In Okinawa, these two philosophies would be put to the ultimate test as the Japanese unleashed their kamikaze attacks in a desperate bid to halt the Allied advance. The kamikaze, the divine wind, was Japan's answer to their dwindling resources and shattered military. Faced with inevitable defeat, Japan's leaders turned to suicide missions, with pilots guiding their aircraft into enemy ships in a final act of defiance. The psychological impact on Allied sailors was enormous. The kamikaze was more than just a weapon. It was a terrifying pilot force designed to break the will of the Allies. The impact of these attacks would be felt not just physically, but psychologically, as sailors faced the constant threat of a deadly, unseen enemy. The first kamikaze attacks at Okinawa were a harbinger of the terror to come. On the morning of the 5th of May, a lone Japanese Zero appeared out of the clouds, diving toward the British carrier HMS Formidable. Despite the heavy anti-aircraft fire from the carrier's defenses, the Zero pressed its attack, crashing into the flight deck near the island. The explosion gouged a massive crater into the steel deck, but remarkably, the armor held. The impact was devastating, but the ship did not sink. Fires raged on the deck, But because the hangar below was sealed and protected, the fire did not spread to the vital areas of the ship. Damage control parties worked frantically to extinguish the flames, and within hours, the ship was back in action. But the price of survival was high. The attack killed 8 men and wounded 47. The crew's resilience, however, was extraordinary. By the afternoon, less than 6 hours later, HMS Formidable was landing aircraft and continuing operations. The British had designed their carriers to endure punishment, and on that day, the armor of the Illustrious-class carrier proved its worth. But the Americans were not so fortunate. Just days later, the USS Bunker Hill, flagship of Task Force 58, would suffer a far worse fate. At 10:04 a.m., on the 11th of May, 2 Kamikaze Zeros piloted by Ensign Koshi Ogawa and Sub-Lieutenant Shizo Yasunori dove towards the carrier. The first Zero hit the wooden flight deck, passing through to the hangar below before exploding in a massive fireball. Seconds later, the second Zero slammed into the island structure, causing catastrophic damage and igniting a fire that spread uncontrollably. The explosion killed 22 pilots and 14 of Admiral Mitcher's staff. The firestorm that followed was apocalyptic. The unarmored, open-sided hangar, designed for operational efficiency, became a death trap, feeding the fire with oxygen and allowing it to spread with terrifying speed. Despite the heroic efforts of the crew to contain the flames, the ship was crippled. Casualties were staggering: 393 men killed or missing, and 264 wounded. Yet, despite the carnage, the crew of the USS Bunker Hill remained determined to save their ship. The damage was so severe that the carrier would have to return to the U.S. for repairs, but its story was not over. The Kamikaze had struck at the heart of the American fleet. The loss was catastrophic, but it revealed the difference between the two design philosophies. The British carriers, though damaged, continued to fight, while the American carrier, despite its overwhelming firepower and technological superiority, was brought down by the very vulnerability of its design. The battle at Okinawa had revealed a chilling truth: the Kamikaze could not be ignored. In the aftermath of the Kamikaze attacks, the difference in the carrier designs became starkly evident. The British Illustrious-class carriers, though smaller and less capable of launching large numbers of aircraft, were able to absorb the punishment of suicide attacks and return to action. The American Essex-class carriers, with their greater offensive capabilities, had one glaring flaw: their flight decks were not armored, and when the Kamikaze attacks hit, they often led to catastrophic losses. The burning wreckage of the USS Bunker Hill served as a grim reminder of the vulnerabilities inherent in the American design. The psychological impact of the Kamikaze attacks on the crews of both the American and British carriers was immense. Sailors now knew that death could come from anywhere: from the sky, from the ocean, and from within their own ranks. The Kamikaze attacks were not just physical blows, but psychological ones. For the Allies, these attacks shattered their sense of invulnerability and made the fight for Okinawa one of pure survival. Survivors of the Kamikaze attacks recalled the horror of seeing their comrades torn apart by the explosions. The sound of the aircraft diving, the deafening roar of the explosion, and the fire that seemed to burn everything in its path, all were burned into their memories. Yet, despite the chaos and destruction, the resolve of the sailors remained unbroken. Their carriers were their homes, and they fought to keep them afloat. On the other hand, the British carriers, having absorbed their own share of Kamikaze attacks, became symbols of endurance and resilience. The crew of HMS Formidable, despite the damage, continued their mission, knowing that their carrier could take a punch and keep fighting. It was a testament to the design philosophy that prioritized survivability, and in the face of the Kamikaze, it proved to be a deciding factor. As the battle for Okinawa continued, the Allies adjusted their tactics. The U.S. Navy began to reinforce the defensive capabilities of their carriers, learning from the lessons of the Kamikaze attacks. The British, on the other hand, continued to rely on their armored flight decks, knowing that their design could withstand the worst of what the Japanese could throw at them. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, it was clear that the battle for control of the Pacific was drawing to a close. The Japanese had thrown everything they had at the Allied fleets, but in the end, the Allies emerged victorious. The Kamikaze had done its damage, but it had not been enough to stop the Allied advance. The legacy of the battle, however, was far-reaching. It wasn't just about the loss of men and ships, but about the lessons learned from the Kamikaze attacks and the contrasting philosophies of naval warfare. The legacy of the armored flight deck, proven on the decks of the British carriers, would influence future naval design. The Americans, recognizing the vulnerability of their Essex-class carriers, incorporated lessons from the British into their future designs. The Midway-class carriers, which would be built in the post-war years, would feature armored flight decks, combining the offensive capabilities of the Essex with the defensive resilience of the British Illustrious-class carriers. The battle at Okinawa had proven that in naval warfare, no design could stand alone. The future of naval aviation would require a blend of offense and defense, with carriers capable of withstanding not just bombs and torpedoes, but the relentless attacks of human-guided missiles. The Kamikaze had forced the world to reconsider the rules of war at sea. As the war in the Pacific drew to a close, the veterans of the battle for Okinawa would carry with them the memories of the Kamikaze attacks, the fear, the destruction, and the unwavering resolve of the sailors who fought and died to keep their ships afloat. The battle had been costly, but it had also been a turning point in the history of naval warfare. The echoes of the battle for Okinawa would not fade quickly. For the sailors who survived the Kamikaze attacks, the scars, both physical and psychological, lingered long after the war ended. The intensity of the battle, the constant threat of death from above, and the devastation wrought by the Japanese suicide bombers had changed naval warfare forever. In the years following the war, military planners and historians would reflect on the lessons of Okinawa. The combination of speed, offense, and defense had proven essential in the face of the Kamikaze. The legacy of that brutal campaign would be felt not only in the design of future warships, but also in the strategies employed during the Cold War, where adaptability and innovation remained at the core of military thinking. The Kamikaze pilots, driven by duty and sacrifice, had altered the course of history. Their legacy was a sobering reminder of the lengths to which nations would go when cornered. The Allied response, with carriers, anti-aircraft defense, and new tactics, proved that victory required more than brute force. It required resilience, adaptation, and unity. As the final reports from Okinawa reached Washington and London, the future of naval warfare was no longer uncertain. The lessons learned from those fateful days in the Pacific shaped the next generation of naval strategy and design. It was no longer just about who had the biggest gun or the thickest armor, but who could adapt quickest to the changing tides of war. In the end, the Battle of Okinawa was not just a chapter in the history of World War II. It was the beginning of a new era for naval warfare, one shaped by the resilience and ingenuity of those who had fought in the Pacific. It was a victory not just over Japan, but over the very nature of war itself.